I think there's a lesson that you're going to hear throughout all of these presentations today. The first lesson is we have to understand our history, and Anne did a great job of helping us understand not only our history in this state, but I think importantly, the second lesson, getting beyond the official reports. And I think these study groups give us a chance to get beyond those, official reports and really do a deep dive. I think there's a third lesson that you're hearing in all of these study groups, and that is building on existing capacity, but also looking at proven or at least tried approaches in the past. And so you'll hear in this different study groups, we just heard lessons learned from other states. In the previous study group, we have some lessons learned that we'll be using in our study group. So building on those lessons and the capacity we have. And then the fourth one, building on what Dudley said, I think, which is very important, is that systems idea. And especially in our committee on low-performing schools, it's not about the dead fish. It's not about something's wrong with the kids because they're not, all we need to do is make the kids do better on tests, and then we've taken care of low-performing schools. It's a system, and there are challenges to the system that I think is part of what this committee needs to unfold. Part of the low-performing schools verbiage does get confused with some of the No Child Left Behind legislation, where we think that it's all about kids needing to do better on tests or better accountability measures. And I think we will be looking at a systems perspective that is trying to consider, what are the systems that need to be in place to support all children learning and being successful. My unique history with low-performing schools, actually, I went to Louisiana in 2004, before Katrina, where they were responding to No Child Left Behind legislation in a state that historically had not had strong support for public education. And then when Hurricane Katrina came and pretty much wiped out, public schools in New Orleans, there was a super challenge because the whole system of education then was needing to be reinvented. And so low-performing schools took on a whole unique role in Louisiana that provides us some lessons learned, not necessarily always good lessons, but lessons learned for how do we look at the system of education and improve a system. Now the difference is we're doing self-surgery. We're not starting all over and just trying to create a whole new system. We're creating a system while we're doing the system. And so I think some of the lessons learned for us need to build on some of the history of what's happened with low-performing schools. Early after No Child Left Behind, there was a lot of legislation on and a lot of money going into turnaround specialists. University of Virginia was one of the places that did a lot with turnaround specialists. The other Broad Institute was bringing in people from outside of education to become education and school leaders. Certainly, to a certain extent, Race to the Top was about preparing leaders who could come in and do things with public schools. I think North Carolina has some special things that we can build on that can improve on a lot of these systems and a lot of these histories, because there is no silver bullet. What has happened in New Orleans and what has happened with recovery school districts in Louisiana and Tennessee are areas to look at, but they're not the silver bullets that we can just put in our chamber and cock off our guns. So some of the strengths that I think we have to build on is, first of all, this state has valued education. And we do have a long history, little mixed perhaps, a little hidden agendas perhaps, but a history that says in our state constitution that we value public education. We have a legacy in this state of innovation, and a lot of you represent some of the innovative activities in this state. Just a few, and I know I won't won't be able to, touch on everyone in here, but certainly in the 1980s, you think about the school science and math and the teaching fellows. Those were models for the country on not only how to prepare students, but also how to prepare teachers. Our North Carolina virtual schools, we were among the first to have a statewide public virtual school program to support schools across the state. The early college-high partnerships, those are an interesting model that was created that was a partnership not only with local LEAs, but also local businesses and higher education. And so crossing some of those lines to create model schools that could really have a different kind of unique focus. Best NC is a recent innovation where we're trying to really build on the public sector, the business sector's support for public education. Certainly the Public School Forum and one of its subsidiaries, the North Carolina Council for After-School Programs, NC CAPS, are areas that have provided a lot of support that make us have capacity that a lot of states don't have. The after-school networks that also include communities and schools. We're one of the states that has a strong communities and school system. NELA, I noticed we have some folks from NELA, Northeast Leadership Academy, models of grow your own leadership. So we have a lot to build on. So this committee, as we're looking at low-performing schools, we're going to be also going through these, history lessons of what has worked, what hasn't worked in other initiatives, whether it's in Louisiana or Tennessee with their low-performing schools approaches, or whether it's some of the issues that we have tried in this state, including some of the Race to the Top initiatives. And so to pass it off to my colleague, Representative Craig Myers, we'll talk a little bit about, sort of where we were with Race to the Top and some of those lessons learned, and then back to personally how that really allows us to move forward in this committee.
So it's been a couple of weeks since we finished legislative session, and maybe you all forgot, but the two big debates that we had about education this year in the legislature were, number one, should elementary school teachers be allowed to go to the bathroom? i.e., should we pay for teachers' assistants, right? And number two, should we actually expect kids to practice driving before they sneak off campus in their cars at lunch? i.e., should we pay for driver's education? Now, unfortunately, if the only headlines you were reading were those, you might have missed two other important conversations that were going on about education in North Carolina. Well, those two things soaked up all the media and far too much of my colleagues' time. One of those was a report from Dr. Gary Henry to the State Board of Education about what we've learned in North Carolina from our work through Race to the Top on how to turn around low-performing schools. I don't know why that wouldn't be front page news, because he actually said, here are some things that you have done. Here are some things that we have learned. Here are some things that we know that work. And they could be done again and again and again. And since it didn't get into the news, we're going to make sure it gets into the study group, right? The second conversation, if you're a big education nerd, maybe you read a little bit about this on EdNC or NC Policy Watch or somewhere else, was a bill that got floated to create an achievement school district, which would have pulled out 5 of the lowest performing elementary schools in the state and put them into a State Board of Education run non-geographic school district. I had a lot of conversations with the sponsor of that bill, Rob Bryan. I didn't agree with his approach. I didn't agree with everything that was in the bill, but I agreed with his assessment of the problem, that we have far too many schools in North Carolina where the children who go to that school for 6 years or 3 years or 4 years are stuck in a negative environment. And we do have a responsibility to do something for those children. And so we want to continue that conversation in our study group as well. We can talk about the Achievement School District, but let's broaden that to think about in the context that Jane talked about and we've heard throughout the day, the context that North Carolinians have many times over their history decided to take big gambles, put forth massive time and energy and money to improve our schools. And that maybe the next step for us, which would tie together all three of these topics, is to say, well, we actually are going to think about what are the types of policies and practices that need to happen so that no child is doomed to a low-performing school year after year after year. I would have loved to let any of these three study groups. I'm a social worker who spent my entire career working in schools. The trauma-sensitive stuff is like right in my professional training, right? I worked for Dr. Neil Peterson for 15 years and led racial equity work in the Chapel Hill Carrboro City Schools. Would love to be in those conversations. I want to be in this conversation about low-performing schools because from my seat in the legislature, I know that we have a specific responsibility to move some of the levers that impact school policies that can change those schools in multiple places around the state. But I also know that I can't write a law that fixes everything that needs to change in a low-performing school. Even if I could figure out what all those things were to write them into law, I don't want to be the legislator that I hated when I was working in schools, that the legislators wrote these laws. I was like, why are you telling me how to do my job? So let me just close with a personal story of why I care so much about this. I worked in the highest performing, most well-resourced school district in the state for my career in North Carolina. I worked for the Chapel Hill schools. When I got into the legislature, I realized that if I was going to really want to be an expert in the legislature on school performance, I needed to learn a little bit about other districts in the state. I'd actually spent some time over the previous years, this is a real education nerd thing to do, I would go to like a conference or on vacation and I would find a really high-performing school, high-performing, high-poverty school in the area where I was going on vacation, and I would go visit that school to see what the really high ones were doing. But I had never visited a persistently low-performing school. So anybody here from Halifax County? God, we talk about Halifax County all the time, but the people from Halifax County so rarely get to talk to us. So I'm going to be guilty of that right now. But I went to Halifax County because I knew it was the lowest performing district in the state. I knew how much it got talked about. And I looked on the data and I said, well, what's the lowest performing school in Halifax County? Is Northwest Halifax High School, or it was at the time. So I went and I spent a day in Northwest Halifax High School with the principal. I saw a school where there were literally padlocks on the toilet paper rolls. A school with a whole wing that was closed. No students could be in that wing because the entire thing was covered with mold. A principal who told me that he has such a hard time attracting teachers that he waits until the middle of September, beginning of October, before really doing his hiring because he needs to see who's left on the state's HR system. Literally getting the bottom of the barrel. So I went home and I wrote a blog and I called it The Worst High School in North Carolina. And I got hammered on social media by people from Halifax County. How dare you call our school the worst high school in North Carolina? I called the principal about 24 hours after the blog went up to apologize for him for slandering his school. He said, are you kidding? It's the best thing that's ever happened to me. I've had about 30 people call in the last 24 hours and offer to volunteer, and I haven't been able to get a volunteer in here in my whole tenure in this school. Funny enough, right? But not enough to change the school, because at the end of that year, that principal got dismissed from his job. So when I think about low-performing schools, that's the one that I think about. I've been to some others since then too, but that's the one that I think about. And I think about the fact that no matter what policies the legislature writes, we need good principals, we need good teachers, we need engaged parents, all these things. And so in our study group, we'll think about all that, top to bottom. And if you give me a task that I can take on, that I can write into a bill, great. But also expect that we'll be giving you some tasks that you can do in whatever your role in education to make a change.